Hey, welcome to the briefing. What I'm going to cover with you today is this. No wrong door still requires the right person. A resident can be transferred several times while the organization insists the request is moving. And technically, that may be true. The resident is moving through the system. The blocker may not be. That distinction is the whole reason I want to work through this with you, because public service systems can generate a lot of activity around a problem without putting the capability needed to resolve that problem at the point where it is actually stuck. As of August 9th, Los Angeles County had announced the formal launch of its designated Aging and Disability Resource Connection Network. The county described it as a coordinated no wrong door approach involving the Los Angeles County Aging and Disabilities Department, the City of Los Angeles Community Investment Department, 211 LA, and 6 regional independent living centers. The designation became effective July 1st, and the county announced it publicly on August 6th. The stated purpose matters. The network is intended to reduce bureaucratic runaround and make it easier for people to begin with a participating organization and receive personalized guidance, coordinated referrals, and direct connections to appropriate resources, rather than being left to navigate multiple organizations by themselves. The broader federal no wrong door model addresses the same kind of problem. People seeking aging, disability, and long-term support services can run into multiple agencies, programs, intake points, and eligibility paths. Coordinated access is supposed to reduce the burden of making the person seeking help figure out that structure alone. I want to keep the evidence boundary clean. Los Angeles County has announced the network and its intended operating model. That does not establish that every referral is resolved perfectly, every handoff is clean, or every resident experiences the network the same way. We cannot responsibly assume those things, and we do not need to. The operating design gives us enough to examine the leadership problem. A person can enter a complicated service system through one point, while the capability required to resolve the actual blocker sits somewhere else. So what happens when the employee in front of the resident or on the phone with the resident has done what the normal process allows them to do, and the blocker still has not moved? No wrong door does not mean every employee knows everything. It does not mean every supervisor becomes the expert in every program. It means the person seeking help should not have to become the system integrator. They should not have to learn your organizational chart, figure out which agency owns which program, identify who has approval, authority, and build their own route through government just to reach somebody who can move the point that is stuck. The org chart should not become a scavenger hunt with office hours. That is the controlling point of this briefing. The resident should not have to understand your organizational chart to reach the person who can actually move the problem. Now put yourself at the level where this decision actually gets made. You supervise a small resident services team. You are not running the county, and you are not rewriting policy. You have a team, a queue, normal service expectations, limited time, and an employee who comes to you because the normal process has reached a point they cannot move. The employee tells you a resident has called back. The resident is trying to understand several support options. Transportation may be part of it, independent living support may be part of it, and another community resource may also be involved. Your employee provided the general information available to the team, checked the resources they are supposed to check, and gave the resident a legitimate referral. The resident contacted that organization, but one part of the problem still has not moved. Your employee looks at you and asks a completely reasonable question. Where do I send them now? That is not a stupid question. They know other programs exist. They know other organizations own responsibilities your team does not own. They know they cannot make decisions outside their authority. So the first instinct is to locate another referral. Find another number, find another program, send the resident to somebody who might know more. And look, that feels responsible because referral is one of the ways complicated systems distribute work. Sometimes that is exactly the correct move. But there is a point where the existence of another referral does not prove another referral is the answer. The question is not, where do I send them next? The better question is, what capability is missing from the current path? The resident has already moved. The request has already moved. The blocker has not. If you keep applying the same mechanism without asking why it stopped producing movement, you can create process cycling. The resident gets moved from one point to another. The problem gets described again. Another employee opens the issue. Another organization reviews what it owns, and another handoff occurs. From inside the organization, that can look productive because everybody did something. Nobody necessarily failed, but the resident is still carrying the unresolved blocker. By the fourth referral, the problem has toured more government offices than the person trying to solve it. That is the first leadership trap, continuing the process because the process still has somewhere else to send the problem. The second trap sits right beside it. The supervisor sees the resident coming back, the queue is building, and the issue sounds complicated, so the supervisor says, "Give it to me." That also feels responsible. You may have more authority, know more people, or understand the system better than the employee does. There are situations where you should step in, but if every complicated problem gets handed to you in full, the team learns that difficult equals supervisor-owned. You accumulate cases, your work slows, and people begin waiting for you. Then one day you realize the organization solved a routing problem by turning you into the routing system. Congratulations, the escalation path has become a person. Somewhere a flowchart just put on khakis, so you have 2 weak responses. Keep referring the resident through a process that is no longer clearing the blocker, or take over the entire issue because the process became complicated. Manual engagement sits between those failures. The objective is not to make the resident somebody else's problem. It is also not for the supervisor to personally resolve transportation, independent living support, eligibility, community resources, and every other service question connected to the case. The objective is to keep the person moving toward the appropriate service without violating authority, creating false promises, bypassing legitimate requirements, or trapping the request in endless routing. That requires the supervisor to identify what is actually stuck. Maybe the resident needs information the current employee does not possess. Maybe a program specialist understands how 2 services interact. Maybe somebody has system access the intake team does not have. Maybe the question requires a specific authority holder. Maybe the blocker is trust, because the resident has already received different answers and no longer knows which answer to rely on. Those are different blockers, and they do not all require the same person. That is where manual engagement enters. Manual engagement is a tool inside Deepin, the decision execution and problem navigation module. At the recognition level, it is used when a blocker inside the problem cannot be cleared through more general process, delay, stabilization, intervention, or redirection alone. And the missing control is the right person's judgment, authority, trust, access, relationship, or technical ability. That does not mean grab the most senior person available. It does not mean put everybody on the problem. It does not automatically mean the leader personally engages. It means the blocker requires human capability, and the person engaging has to match the capability the blocker actually requires. The resident does not necessarily need another organization. More precisely, the blocker may need a capability the current path does not have. Think about that service center supervisor again. This is an illustrative direct action scenario based on the operating condition. I am not claiming this happened to a specific resident or employee inside Los Angeles County. The initial referral did not resolve the specific point the resident is asking about. The weak response is another blind handoff. The opposite weak response is for the supervisor to absorb the whole case. The better read is narrower. What is the unresolved point? What capability would actually move that point? And who has that capability? That is recognition. I am deliberately stopping there because the full manual engagement method goes deeper into how the blocker is defined, how capability is matched, how engagement is bounded, how authority is controlled, and where the work goes after the blocker is handled. That deeper application belongs in the training, and there is another part of this that matters if you supervise people. The right person does not have to own the whole problem. They need to own the blocker that requires them. If one program specialist has the knowledge required to clarify a specific service question, that does not mean the specialist becomes responsible for the entire resident situation. If a supervisor has authority to approve one specific decision, that does not mean the supervisor takes over the whole service relationship. If a partner has direct access to information your team cannot reach, that does not mean your team abandons its responsibilities. That is why manual engagement is not micromanagement. Micromanagement expands the leader into work other people can and should own. Manual engagement narrows the involvement to a blocker that specifically requires a person with the right capability. And if you are leading a small team, your instinct to help can become your own operating trap. An employee brings you one difficult issue, you solve it. Another arrives, you solve that. And then everybody learns, how to get complicated things unstuck. Before long, you are chasing approvals, calling other departments, managing resident issues, handling the queue, and trying to do your own work somewhere in between. The team is busy, you are buried, and everybody is calling it leadership because you are involved in everything. This is where the operating model gets so stupid it becomes visual. The supervisor is sitting under a laminated continuity plan with 3 phones ringing, 2 chat windows open, employees lined up at the door, and every arrow on the workflow chart somehow pointing directly at their forehead. Take away the cartoon, and the consequence remains. The county does not have a process at that point. It has one exhausted human being impersonating infrastructure. If the leader takes over every complicated case, the operation becomes dependent on the leader while the team becomes less capable of navigating the parts they actually own. Ownership does not mean I personally touch every difficult thing. Ownership means I make sure the right thing happens through the right person, at the right point, within the authority that actually exists. Now look at the consequence chain when the organization misses that distinction. The resident gets transferred again and explains the situation again. A new employee has to understand what already happened, review notes, check the previous referral, or ask the resident to repeat information. That consumes staff time. If the next organization cannot clear the blocker, another referral occurs. Another employee touches the issue. Maybe the resident calls the original service center again because that is the only place they recognize. Now the first employee is back in the problem and the supervisor gets asked for help again. Meanwhile, the queue did not stop. Other residents are waiting, other calls are entering, and the unresolved blocker starts consuming capacity beyond the original request. Then confidence erodes. Staff stop trusting the referral path, and the resident becomes less confident that anyone actually owns the issue. The organization may still be able to show that several contacts occurred, but that is not the same as showing progress. A referral is activity. Resolution is movement. 5 people touched the request. Fine. Did the blocker move? The resident received 3 phone numbers. Fine. Did any of those numbers reach the capability required? 2 organizations responded. Good. Did the resident get closer to the objective? What we need to understand is the part that matters here is whether the activity changed the condition. You can document every handoff perfectly and still build a failure with excellent paperwork. The resident is still stuck, but somewhere the spreadsheet is having a fantastic quarter. I have made versions of that mistake myself. You see activity, you see people working, you see the issue getting handed forward, and your first instinct is to think the operation is moving. Then the same problem comes back through the door, and you realize movement was happening around the blocker, not through it. A supervisor close to the work usually has more influence over this than they think. You may not control the county-wide system, another agency, eligibility rules, funding, or program design. Fine. You do not need control over everything to improve the decision in front of you. You can inspect the blocker before sending your employee through another cycle. You can recognize when the issue has moved beyond the capability of your team. You can avoid blaming the employee for reaching a legitimate boundary. You can avoid taking over the whole case because one part requires higher capability. There is a justice standard here too. A frontline employee should not be punished because they correctly recognized the boundary of their role. Good leadership does not say, you should have owned it harder and then stop thinking. Did the employee have the authority, the information, the training, the access, and the support? Was the requirement clear? If they had those things and did not perform, evaluate the performance against the standard. But if they did not have the capability required to clear the blocker, additional effort does not magically manufacture capability. You cannot withhold the means and then condemn the person for not producing the result. That creates a different accountability problem because now the resident stays stuck and the employee gets blamed for a system boundary they did not create. Responsibility has to stay connected to control. If the employee can answer the question, they should answer it. If they own the follow-up, they should complete it. And if the process gives them a legitimate next step, they should use it. If they failed to do what was clearly theirs to do, correct that. But when the blocker requires something they do not possess, leadership has to recognize the condition accurately. The Los Angeles County No Wrong Door model gives us a useful larger frame because the participating organizations have different roles, capabilities, systems, programs, and points of access. The value of coordination is that the resident should not be forced to personally integrate all of those differences just to find a useful path. That same principle applies at the team level. Your employee does not need to become the expert in every function. Your supervisor does not need to absorb the entire network. The organization needs enough discipline to recognize when the current service point has reached a blocker that requires somebody else's capability. Then the engagement needs to be purposeful, not random, not another blind transfer, not escalation for the sake of escalation, and not a permanent transfer of ownership because a specialist became involved. There's also a trust dimension. Imagine being the resident who has already explained the issue 3 times. The 4th employee may be competent and may have done nothing wrong, but the resident is no longer entering that interaction with the same confidence they had on the first call. They have spent time, they may have rearranged work or transportation. They may have called several numbers or heard different pieces of information. Now the next employee inherits frustration created by the system before that employee even says hello. Sometimes the blocker is no longer only information. Trust has become part of the operating condition. Another generic handoff can make that worse. The leader has to recognize when the next interaction requires somebody who can credibly explain the situation, clarify what is known, identify what is not known, and move the specific point without making promises the organization cannot support. Maybe that is the supervisor, maybe it is a program lead, a partner contact, or somebody with direct access to the service information. The question is capability. That is manual engagement. Manual engagement is not every hand on the problem. It is the right hands on the blocker. If the missing piece is program knowledge, find the person with the knowledge. If the missing piece is authority, reach the authority holder. If the missing piece is direct access, get the person with the access. If the missing piece is trust, use the person positioned to have that conversation. The objective is controlled movement. This is where a cleaner CSA read matters before manual engagement ever becomes the answer. CSA helps the supervisor separate what is visible from what is actually happening. The visible issue is that the resident called back. Fine. Why did they call back? Did the employee provide the wrong referral? Did the receiving organization misunderstand the request? Did the issue change? Did the process reach a point requiring authority, expertise, access, or trust that was not present? Those are different conditions. If the supervisor skips that read and jumps straight to escalation, the wrong person may get involved. If the supervisor assumes the employee failed, they may correct the wrong issue. If the supervisor takes over before understanding what is stuck, they may solve around the blocker instead of identifying it. CSA improves the read, then deepen helps determine what kind of problem navigation response fits. Not every stuck issue requires manual engagement. Sometimes the problem can wait, sometimes a temporary control is enough, and sometimes the obstacle can be redirected. Sometimes the issue needs direct intervention. Sometimes nobody knows enough yet, and more analysis is required. Manual engagement matters when the missing control is the right human capability. Once the right person engages, TMC matters because ownership and communication can drift. The employee needs to know what changed. The person engaging needs to understand what they are being asked to resolve. The resident needs clear information about what happens next. The supervisor needs to know whether the blocker was handled or whether another problem navigation decision is required. That is enough system connection for this episode. Read the situation, identify the kind of blocker you actually have, and use the human capability that fits when human capability is the missing control. Protect ownership and communication afterward. Manual engagement remains the tool. Now bring this back to your environment. Listen when an employee says, "I already sent them there." Maybe the referral was correct and the receiving organization simply needs time. Do not create unnecessary escalation because somebody is impatient. But if the resident keeps returning and the same blocker remains, ask whether the referral mechanism is still capable of moving the issue. Listen when somebody says, only this person can approve that. If that is genuinely true, sending the issue through people without that authority is not progress. Listen when the team says, just give it to the supervisor. Does the whole issue require supervisory ownership, or has the organization learned that the supervisor is the easiest route around unclear process? Those are different problems. Pay attention when a resident has to repeatedly explain the same situation. That is one of the clearest signs that the organization may be transferring the integration burden onto the person asking for help. Each employee may be doing their part correctly, but if the resident has become responsible for carrying context from one part of the system to another, then the organization may have lost ownership of the handoff, even while everybody believes they completed their piece. There is another consequence if you miss this. Your employees start learning the wrong lesson. If every difficult resident issue gets taken away from them, they learn that complexity means stop thinking and wait for the boss. If every difficult issue gets pushed back down with some version of own it, they learn that asking for help is dangerous, even when the problem genuinely exceeds their authority. One creates dependency, the other creates concealment. What you want is judgment. You want an employee who can say, I handled the intake and verified the referral. The resident is still blocked because the next decision requires program authority I do not have. Who owns that authority? Now we are getting somewhere. That employee is not dumping the problem. They are describing the blocker. And your response teaches the team whether that kind of thinking is worth doing. If somebody brings you a thoughtful boundary and you punish them for not magically having more authority, they will stop bringing you thoughtful boundaries. If somebody dumps routine work on you and you automatically take it over, they will keep dumping routine work on you. Your response teaches the standard. From the resident's side, they do not care that your internal process chart has 7 boxes. They do not care that one program is county operated, another is city operated, another is a nonprofit partner, and another uses a different intake path. Those distinctions may matter operationally, legally, financially, administratively, or programmatically. But the resident should not have to become an expert in those distinctions just to figure out where the right capability exists. For the supervisor, the translation is simple. Do not make the resident carry the coordination burden your organization is capable of carrying itself. That does not mean promise an outcome you cannot deliver, bypass requirements, guarantee eligibility, or make one employee own everything. It means when the current path reaches a blocker, recognize what capability is missing before sending the person back into the maze. Could you overuse manual engagement? Absolutely. If every problem suddenly requires the program, director, specialist, supervisor, relationship owner, senior manager, or the one person everybody trusts, then you have built dependency. Maybe the process needs repair, maybe authority is too concentrated, maybe people need more training or information is inaccessible. Maybe one person has become the only person who understands the service. Those are larger problems. Manual engagement is not permission to keep a fragile system fragile because one expert can rescue it. The blocker may require the person. The whole operation should not require the person forever. If one person becomes the answer to every exception, difficult call, unusual handoff, and approval question, eventually that person is holding the system up. At that point, the specialist is not support anymore. They are unofficial infrastructure with a calendar and a lunch break everyone quietly resents. When they leave, take vacation, change roles, or hit capacity, all of that hidden dependency becomes visible. Apparently, the continuity plan was just hoping Carol never took Friday off. That can become a serious operating problem very quickly. Here is the field level check I want you to carry. When somebody on your team brings you a problem that already moved through the normal process, do not immediately add another referral. Do not immediately take the problem away from them either. Ask what is actually still stuck. Ask what the normal process has already accomplished. Ask what capability is missing now. And ask whether the whole problem needs higher level involvement or whether one blocker needs the right person. Those questions do not execute manual engagement for you. They stop you from confusing another handoff with another solution. Some blockers do not need more process. They need the right person. And the right person does not need to own everything. They need to engage the point that requires them so the larger objective can continue moving. That is why No Wrong Door translates so cleanly into an operating leadership lesson. The person seeking help should not have to understand every department, program, partner, authority point, and service boundary before somebody can help them navigate the system. At the same time, the employee who answers the first call cannot reasonably be expected to possess every capability inside that system. Leadership exists between those realities. You protect the resident from being trapped in the organizational maze. You protect the employee from being held responsible for authority or expertise they do not possess. You protect the supervisor from becoming the permanent answer to every difficult issue. And you protect the objective by putting the right human capability where the process has genuinely reached its limit. That is manual engagement. The resident should not have to become the system integrator. The employee should not have to pretend they possess authority they do not have. The supervisor should not confuse taking over everything with leading well. And the organization should not confuse movement through process with movement of the blocker. When normal process stops moving the blocker, identify what human capability is missing. Then get the right person onto the point that is actually stuck. When you are ready to go deeper with this tool, go to www.direct-action-system.io/course-directory. Open the course directory, find the Deepen course where manual engagement is taught, and start there. That is where the deeper application belongs. Thanks for listening to the briefing.